Well, this spring could be the most pivotal moment for Ukraine since Russia invaded nearly a year ago, and that's according to U.S. officials who are concerned that time and support are not on their side. Spring is going to be a crucial moment, and we're really pleased to have joining us on the program once again Yasmin Abutaleb from the Washington Post, White House reporter. And Yasmin, you have a great piece in the Washington Post about some of those warnings to Ukraine about this pivotal, wow, it must be a Friday, pivotal moments in the battle. And you've had a busy day besides. You've been over at the White House press briefing as well, and we appreciate you joining us. Give us some perspective in terms of what's the lay of the land as we get to that 1 year mark.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. So the U.S. is telling Ukraine, right now they have a guarantee over the next several months that security assistance, billions of dollars of aid, weapons, heavy tanks from both the U.S. and its allies are coming in, and they want Ukraine to try to capitalize on that as much as possible. The war has really been sort of a slow grind in eastern Ukraine for some months now. Neither side has made significant gains, so there is concerns about this being a war of attrition, but we know Russia is planning an offensive. Ukraine wants to be able to mount a counteroffensive to try to retake critical territory, and the U.S. is telling them, this is one of your best opportunities to try to change the trajectory of the war. We know this money is coming in. We know these weapons are going to be coming. The political dynamics in the U.S., this is just a reality everyone has to face. Republicans took control of the House in January, and while the White House says they're confident they'll still get more aid if they need it in a few months, there are no guarantees as to how much it could be or if the White House will get what it's asked for, which thus far it has every single time it's gone to Congress and asked for money.
Yeah, so important. And any sense from your perspective, we've been trying to dissect a little bit, is Ukraine better off just really trying to hunker down and control the Donbass, which we know Vladimir Putin would love to have for the natural gas and all the other minerals and resources? Do they try to go back at Crimea, which again, I think Vladimir Putin thinks he can control that in the Black Sea. And Vladimir Putin seems to say, hey, I can have both of these forks in the road. But from the Ukrainian standpoint, knowing this is a critical time, can they play both of those strategies, or they just need to pick one and go?
This is a really important question because this hits at another sort of point of tension between the U.S. and Ukraine. Of course, the U.S. says we're not going to tell Ukraine what to do. We just advise them. They guide them on intel and let them know what their military analysts know, but it's ultimately up to the Ukrainians what they decide to do. But their concern is that Ukraine cannot play the same game Russia is playing here. Ukraine cannot deploy forces everywhere Russia is sending them. So I think a really good example of this right now is Bakhmut, one of these cities in the east, where Russia has sent a lot of convicts, untrained, unskilled fighters to try to take the city. The U.S. says there's really no strategic value to the city, and Ukraine has lost a lot of their skilled fighters on the front lines in Bakhmut over the last couple of months. And the U.S. is saying, look, you can't defend Bakhmut and simultaneously launch a counteroffensive and do both of those things well. So they want the Ukrainians to prioritize. They think the counteroffensive is much more important than defending Bakhmut, conceding that it does have symbolic importance. And the same with Crimea. U.S. Intelligence agencies have determined that right now Ukraine cannot retake Crimea. Their forces aren't going to be able to do that anytime soon. They've briefed Congress about this. But of course, it is very symbolically important for the Ukrainians that the fight in this war be to retake all of Ukraine.
And that's, we always say focus precedes success, and focus always precedes success, especially when you're dealing with limited resources or people power that becomes so difficult and so challenging. There's also that underlying component of just how important this moment is in that. And you pointed out in your piece in the Washington Post, talking about the fact that Vice President Harris, Secretary of State Blinken are in Germany over the weekend. The president, of course, is traveling to Poland next week. The stakes are clearly high and getting higher for Ukraine and for those critical components of the allies there in Europe.
Absolutely. It's no coincidence that you have the president and the vice president and the secretary of state and the defense secretary all visiting Europe in just a few days span. And, of course, the president's visit to Poland being probably the most remarkable of those. So I think we can fully expect Vice President Harris in her address tomorrow, President Biden, when he gives an address next week in Poland, to really try to affirm the U.S. commitment to Ukraine, to try to show that there's no defections or weakening of resolve among the Western alliance. They're hoping to send this very clear signal to Putin. That might all be true. But again, that doesn't really forecast how the next few months will go, or how long Europeans and even the U.S. and Congress will be willing to keep supporting this war.
Yeah, and I think for the European allies in particular, where their citizens are really feeling it much more than we're feeling it here in the United States. Europeans are dealing with it in terms of gas prices and heating for their homes and so on. They're really feeling it. I think that becomes a real tension point. Any insight on the president's speech in Poland? I actually have felt that the speech he gave a year ago in Poland was one of the best of his administration. I think he was very strong and very clear in that. Anything you expect to see in that speech that we should be watching for? Some subtle messages.
I've heard from a lot of White House officials that they also think that was one of the best speeches of his presidency. I think, really you're going to see the president saying this is a battle, democracy versus autocracy, and the world needs to stand by Ukraine. He's going to try to make this about something bigger than just the specific fight between Russia and Ukraine, to try to maintain global support for this war. There, of course, has been a lot of countries, not necessarily in the U.S., or Canada or the Western Alliance, but in the global South, who have really grown pretty tired of the war because of the global economic repercussions, the food shortages that have resulted. And so I think you're going to see the president try to make the case for sticking with Ukraine. We don't know if he'll announce, some new security assistance or military assistance for Ukraine. We haven't really gotten much indication of that. But I think, him being there, him being in Eastern Europe, physically so close to Ukraine, is going to be him trying to send this very clear signal that the U.S. is not going anywhere.
Yeah, and any sense from your sources, Yasmin, in terms of the insight of Russia? We know they've had a little bit of a brain drain. Some 500,000 to 1 million of their high-tech folks have left the country. I always say it's sad, too, because I think a lot of those are people who could affect change inside the country. Any signs internally that Vladimir Putin is navigating as we get to these spring offensives and counteroffensives?
Well, we know that, there's been, as you mentioned, there's been this big exodus from Russia. There have been Russians who have not supported the war. There have been high-level Russian officials who have questioned Vladimir Putin's judgment and leadership. There have been these questions surrounding his health. And so I think, there has been some sort of speculation over how long he's going to be willing to stick with this. But I think one important thing to note is that a lot of experts I've talked to have mentioned this, that Vladimir Putin is still hoping the West will get tired, will not want to continue to support Ukraine. Russia has far more troops than Ukraine does. And, of course, while the U.S. and its Western allies are sending heavy weaponry and money, they're not sending troops. And so I think he's still hoping he can kind of wait out the West and then try to retake these critical parts of the East.
Yasmin Abudullah from the White House, reporter for the Washington Post. And Yasmin, always appreciate your perspective. Great writing, great sourcing, great perspective as always. We appreciate you joining us on Inside Sources.
Thanks so much for having me.
Always great perspective there. I love the way that Yasmin goes at these issues, and it's never just the top line stuff. She understands what it means to get to the nuances that are so often missed in media, in social media, in a headline world that we live in. And so we have to learn to think that way. That's why I love to have Yasmin on the program, is because she gets you to think beyond just the obvious stuff and get to the nuances where all of these things are really going to be decided in the end. And especially when it comes to Ukraine, the spring is going to be pivotal, and we're going to continue to watch closely what is happening, the offenses, the support, the long-term strategy. It all has to come together.
We're following breaking news as we come on the air about the condition of former President Jimmy Carter. The Carter Center, the charity founded by the 39th president, announcing that Carter has entered home hospice care, opting to refuse further medical intervention after several brief hospital stays. At 98, Carter is the oldest ever living president. The current president, Joe Biden, paid a visit to Carter and his wife, Rosalind, at their home in Plains, Georgia, shortly after he was elected. Carter, who served one term as president, will likely be best remembered for his more than 4 decades as a former president and his charitable works like Habitat for Humanity and his efforts at peace across the globe, winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002. Carter defeated incumbent Gerald Ford in the race for the White House in 1976 on the heels of the Watergate scandal, but he lost his own re-election bid to Ronald Reagan in 1980 during the Iranian hostage crisis. Carter largely retreating from the public eye in recent years. ABC's Mary Alice Parks leads us off tonight from the White House.
Tonight, word that former President Jimmy Carter is with his family at home in Plains, Georgia, receiving end-of-life hospice care. The Carter Center in Atlanta saying that after a series of short hospital stays, Carter decided to receive hospice care instead of additional medical intervention. He has the full support of his family and his medical team. The center adding that his family is grateful for the concern shown by so many of his admirers. At 98 years old, Carter is the oldest living former U.S. president ever, serving one term from 1977 to 1981. A peanut farmer and naval engineer, he remains the only president from Georgia. Leaving office, he continued a life of public service, working with Habitat for Humanity for decades, building homes for those in need around the country and the world. He has battled serious health issues before, hip surgery in 2019, and in 2015, he confronted a cancer that had spread to his liver and brain. Shortly after taking office, President Biden visited with Carter and his wife, Rosalind, at their Georgia home. His grandson tweeting a short while ago, "I saw both my grandparents yesterday. They are at peace. And as always, their home is full of love. Thank you for all of your kind words."
Mary Alice Parks joining us from the White House. And Mary Alice, still a lot we don't know about former President Carter's condition, but you're getting some late word from his family tonight.
Yeah, with that tweet from his grandson, who's also there in Georgia, saying that his grandparents' home, as always, is full of love and that they are at peace. We are also learning that the president is aware of the Carter condition. Whit.
All right, Mary Alice, thank you. Now to the war in Ukraine, the U.S. with its strongest condemnation yet of Russia and its actions during the invasion. Vice President Kamala Harris declaring that Russia has committed crimes against humanity. Harris telling a security conference in Munich that Russia has conducted a systemic attack against the civilian population of Ukraine. All of this as the war approaches the one-year mark. ABC's Patrick Reevell from Ukraine tonight.
It's one of the most grievous charges that can be prosecuted. Vice President Kamala Harris today accusing Russia of committing crimes against humanity, a designation going beyond war crimes.
We know the legal standards, and there is no doubt these are crimes against humanity.
Harris in front of world leaders at the Munich Security Conference saying Russian forces have engaged in a systemic attack against a civilian population, citing offences of murder, torture, rape and deportation.
Civilians shot in cold blood.
The eastern city of Bakhmut now experiencing its own horror. Ukrainian snipers here taking aim, with Russia continuing to push thousands of their troops into a new onslaught, yet estimated to be suffering hundreds of casualties a day. Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade saying this video shows their men in trenches on the front line. Ukrainian troops telling ABC they too are taking heavy losses. This Ukrainian officer monitoring the Russian advance, saying they are coming from the north, east and south, but emphasizing that Ukraine is holding on. The price of that resistance is painfully visible at this rehabilitation clinic, where badly wounded Ukrainian soldiers are learning how to move again. Andriy Stetsko has been unable to walk since an anti-tank mine blew up his vehicle. He tells me Ukraine is paying a very high price for their freedom, but he says it can't be another way. His doctor, Klimovic, saying most of her patients now are young men.
What do you think when you look at patients like that?
Dr. Klimovic turns away, unable to hold back tears. I don't have the right to cry, she says, but we will win. Everything will be okay.
Nearly a year of this. Patrick Reevell joining us now from Kyiv. And Patrick, there's also news tonight about Secretary of State Blinken confronting China over their support for Russia and Ukraine.
Yes, Secretary of State Antony Blinken told our Martha Raddatz earlier that the U.S. is increasingly concerned that China is considering giving lethal aid to Russia. He confronted his Chinese counterpart in Munich, and the U.S. has already sanctioned Chinese companies for supplying Russia's military. Whit?
Patrick, thank you. We turn now to the deadly rampage in Mississippi. 6 people killed, authorities identifying the victims. They say the dead include the suspect's ex-wife and stepfather. The victims shot at 3 separate locations. The suspect seen on these surveillance images that are part of a police investigation. He's now in custody and facing possible murder charges. Here's ABC's Faith Abube.
Tonight, the Tate County Deputy Coroner identifying all 6 victims who died in a mass shooting in the small town of Acabutla, Mississippi. Among them, Deborah Crum, the ex-wife of suspect Richard Crum. Crum allegedly shot 4 of the people just behind his own home: his stepfather, George McCain, George's 2 friends, and George's sister, Linda. Linda's daughters, Tammy and Debbie, are devastated.
We're sad. We're shocked. We're going to miss our mom.
Linda's daughters tell us they saw no signs of tension in the home. In fact, Crum was the stepfather's caretaker.
Uncle George was so good to him and took care of him.
They had just shared breakfast the day before. We want to know what would trigger a person to do such an evil thing.
The shooting rampage began around 11 a.m. Friday, about 30 miles south of Memphis. And over the course of several hours, police say Crum shot his victims at 3 separate locations, including a convenience store. This surveillance image of the harrowing moments inside, now part of the investigation.
Without being able to say this is what triggered this or this is why this happened is what's the real scary part.
And now 2 sisters preparing to bury their mother and uncle.
They would give people the shirt off their back. They never met a stranger, and many people loved them because they were so kind.
And tonight, Crum remains in jail on 1 count of first-degree murder, but authorities say more charges are pending. Whit.
Faith Abube, thank you. Next tonight, FEMA is on the ground in East Palestine, Ohio, more than 2 weeks after that fiery train derailment. Toxic chemicals leaking into the air and water. Federal health officials also heading to the region as residents are growing increasingly frustrated, demanding answers. ABC's Mona Kosar Abdi in Ohio tonight.
Tonight, as FEMA arrives in East Palestine, Ohio, residents increasingly anxious 2 weeks after that fiery train derailment and toxic chemical spill.
I am asking that they trust the government, and that's hard. We know that there is a lack of trust.
While the Environmental Protection Agency maintains that the air and water are safe.
Watch this. Just see that chemical.
Republican Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio visited Leslie Run, a local stream, tweeting video of what he describes as pollution in the water.
I've had massive headaches since it started.
And locals say they're feeling the effects of the toxic chemicals, which include known carcinogen vinyl chloride, a colorless gas used to make some plastics and also produced in tobacco smoke. Chris Ammon says he bought this property so that his grandchildren could play in the creek.
I ain't putting them in it this year. I don't know if I'll ever put them back in it.
Some have left their homes entirely. Christina Ferguson moved into a hotel because at home, she says the water just isn't right.
You get a tingling in your tongue and on your lips, heaviness in the chest. It's not a headache, it's pressure, it's dizziness.
And the CEO of Norfolk Southern is in East Palestine today, meeting with local residents in a bipartisan effort. Both Ohio senators wrote a letter calling on the state and federal EPA to ensure regular testing for toxic chemicals. Also, former President Donald Trump announced today that he will visit the area on Wednesday. Whit.
Mona Kosar Abdi reporting from Ohio. Thank you. Now to the weather whiplash. Much of the East Coast experiencing an Arctic plunge with temperatures in some places dropping 50 degrees in just 24 hours. Let's get right to meteorologist Danielle Breezy from our affiliate WKRN in Nashville. She's here in New York City tonight. And Danielle, what's in store for the rest of the weekend?
Whit, it's a shock to your system, but the good news, it is short-lived. New York City yesterday went from 61 for a high to 21 this morning. But take a look at this. The east is going to warm up as we head into next week. 60s in Richmond on Monday. By Thursday, we're actually going to be in the 80s. Meanwhile, the western half of the country gets really, really cold as we track our next cross-country system. It's bringing snow to Wyoming and Montana already this weekend. It strengthens on Monday. Tuesday, it is going to bring rain to the west coast. The interior will see some snow. Wednesday, we're going to see snow across the Midwest and the Rockies. Meanwhile, the South sees the rain and storms, and some of those storms could be on the severe weather side. As we get into Thursday, we're going to see that rain push to the East Coast. There could be a wintry mix to the Northeast. We're going to be tracking it all for you. Whit.
Some big changes on the way. Danielle, thank you. Turning now to North Korea, the U.S. and its allies strongly condemning the country's latest ballistic missile launch. These images here show what is believed to be that projectile. It landed in the Sea of Japan. No damage to shipping or aircraft, but the launch, the second by the North this year, only raising concerns. ABC's Britt Clennett reporting from Hong Kong.
Tonight, tensions rising after the US National Security Council says North Korea launched an intercontinental ballistic missile that landed in Japanese waters. This new video released earlier today showing what Japanese military officials say appears to be a missile falling from the sky.
This is an outrageous act which escalates the level of provocation against the international community. Such act is absolutely unacceptable.
The United States also strongly condemning North Korea, saying this launch is a flagrant violation of multiple UN Security Council resolutions. Japanese officials say the missile was launched from the suburbs of Pyongyang, flying for nearly 66 minutes and roughly 560 miles before falling into the Japanese exclusive economic zone west of the island of Hokkaido. So far, no reports of ships or aircraft damaged.
What's extraordinary about this video is that you can see the actual flames when it zooms in on the missile body falling. That suggests that this came awfully close to landing on Japanese soil.
Officials say today's launch is the first ICBM test since back in November, when North Korea fired the powerful Hwasong-17 ICBM.
With North Korea now confirming that was an ICBM. State media saying the sudden drill is aimed at confirming the weapon's reliability. Whit?
All right, Britt Clennet, our thanks to you tonight. We learned late today that Secretary of State Antony Blinken has met with his Chinese counterpart just 2 weeks after American fighter jets shot down that Chinese spy balloon off the South Carolina coast. One American official saying the meeting lasted about an hour. Afterward, Blinken, in that sit-down with Martha Raddatz, saying it was productive.
We know you met with your Chinese counterpart, Wang Li. That's the highest level conversations between the U.S. and China since the Chinese spy balloon was shot down. What can you tell us about that meeting?
We had a very direct, very clear conversation about the Chinese surveillance balloon being sent over our territory in violation of our sovereignty, in violation of international law. I told Wang Yi, my Chinese counterpart, that that action was unacceptable and must never happen again. It was important for me to underscore the importance of having open lines of communication between us in continuing to engage in direct diplomacy. We have a responsibility to manage the relationship responsibly. I think the world expects that of us.
You can see Martha's full interview with Secretary of State Antony Blinken on This Week, tomorrow morning after GMA. Next tonight, a brazen attack in Karachi, Pakistan. Authorities say 3 militants fired on a policeman leaving a mosque, then moved on to a police station. Gunfire and explosions could be heard for several hours. At least 4 people, including 3 police officers, were killed. 3 attackers also died, at least one blowing himself up inside the building. This latest violence comes 2 weeks after a suicide bomber killed more than 100 people at a mosque in the northwest of the country. And in Turkey and Syria, the death toll now surpassing 46,000, 12 days after that massive earthquake. A couple and their son were pulled alive from the rubble of a collapsed apartment building 296 hours after the quake. Sadly, the boy later died. The bodies of the family's 2 other children were also found, and we're learning that USAID teams have started to leave Turkey as crews concentrate more on recovery. There's still much more ahead on World News Tonight this Saturday, including tearful goodbyes today for 2 students killed on the Michigan State campus.